In 1858, on Louisiana's Plantation, an enslaved black woman named Mara simply vanished. That same night, 17 overseers were discovered dead in places they had no business being. Hours before, those same men had laughed as the master declared that Mara's young son would be ripped from her arms before sunrise. Certain she lacked the strength to fight back. By daybreak, their bodies lay scattered across the estate. Collapsed barns, ruined storerooms, locked quarters. Every man caught in a scenario he believed he commanded. No one witnessed Mara's departure, and no one could explain how she moved or how those deaths aligned so perfectly with the very weaknesses the overseers themselves had enforced. Charles Ellington swore she had drowned in the marsh, but his own men whispered she had outmaneuvered every trap they had designed for others. So what truly unfolded in those final hours before Mara vanished? And how did the overseers' unwavering confidence in their control become the very reason they never anticipated her escape? Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Dawn broke over the Ellington plantation like a wound, splitting the sky open. The light arrived first as a faint gray suggestion through the pines, then spread in pale orange streaks that did nothing to soften the harsh edges of the world below. Mara Ellington was already awake when the bell rang across the quarters. She had been up since before the rooster stirred, her hands already moving through the familiar motions of preparation. She worked by candlelight in the small cabin she shared with Jonas, grinding dried elderflower into powder with a smooth river stone. Her movements were exact, intentional. Each rotation of the stone matched the one before it. This was how she approached everything, with painstaking attention to detail, with patience that looked like acceptance, but was actually something far different. Jonas slept in the corner on a straw mattress, his breathing soft and steady. He was 8 years old, small for his age, but sharp-minded. She watched him for a moment, memorizing the way the candlelight caught the curve of his cheek. Then she returned to her task. By the time the second bell rang, Mara had gathered her supplies into a worn canvas satchel. Strips of clean linen, small clay jars filled with salves and tinctures, dried leaves bundled with twine. She stepped through the door, just as the first workers emerged from their cabins, joining the silent procession toward the fields. The air was thick with humidity, pressing against skin like a damp cloth. Mara walked with her eyes lowered, but her attention razor-sharp, noting everything. Which overseer stood at which post, how Brent leaned against the fence near the tool shed, already half drunk, how Cole paced the perimeter with his rifle, stopping every 12 steps to scan the tree line, how Harker sat on his horse near the main house, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. She had been watching them for years, studying them the way a scholar studies books. The field workers knew to find her near the eastern edge of the cotton rows, where a fallen oak created natural shelter from the sun. This was where she treated injuries too minor to warrant the attention of the white doctor in town. A gashed hand from a broken tool, a twisted ankle, a burn from the rendering fires. She worked quietly, cleaning wounds with boiled water, applying poultices, wrapping bandages with gentle efficiency. "Hold still," she told an older man named Samuel, whose forearm bore a deep scratch from barbed wire. Her voice was calm. It was always calm. "This will sting, but it keeps infection out." Samuel hissed when she pressed the tincture, soaked cloth against his skin, but he did not pull away. People trusted Mara. She had steady hands, and she never gossiped. In a world where privacy was a luxury no one could afford, discretion was worth more than gold. By mid-morning, The sun had climbed high enough to turn the air into something solid. Mara finished with the last worker and gathered her supplies. She needed to restock from the root cellar behind the main house, where dried herbs hung from the rafters and clay jars lined the shelves. The path took her past the wide veranda where the master sometimes sat to smoke his pipe. Today, both Charles Ellington and his brother Warren stood there, their voices carrying across the yard. Mara kept her pace steady, her eyes forward, but she listened. "The debt is considerable," Warren said. His voice had the clipped precision of a man who spent his time counting other people's money. "You can't continue this way. I'm aware." Charles sounded irritated, defensive. "I have assets. Assets that eat and require clothing and supervision. You're spending more than you earn." A pause. Mara reached the corner of the house where the angle would hide her from view, but leave her within earshot. She knelt and pretended to adjust the strap on her satchel. "The boy," Warren said, "the healer woman's son. He's young, healthy, teachable. Blanchard has been asking after house servants. He would pay well." Mara's hands stopped moving. Her entire body went very still. "By week's end," Warren continued, "the transaction could be complete before month's end. It would cover half your debt immediately." "Fine." Charles sounded bored now, as if they were discussing livestock. "Arrange it." Their footsteps moved away back into the house. The door closed with a heavy thud. Mara remained crouched by the corner of the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face showed nothing. She took a slow breath through her nose. Then another. Then she stood, adjusted her satchel, and continued toward the root cellar as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She spent the afternoon moving through the plantation with purpose, disguised as routine. She visited the supply shed to restock bandages, noting the layout of shelves and the location of lantern oil. She delivered a jar of salve to the overseers, sleeping quarters for Harker's persistent cough, observing the positions of beds in the single window that faced the woods. She checked on a pregnant woman in the quarters near the main road, counting steps and memorizing the distance to the tree line. Her mind worked like a map, plotting points and measuring spaces. She had always possessed this ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, to find order in disorder. It was what made her good at healing. It was what would make her good at what came next. The overseers moved through their duties with lazy confidence. They had been doing this for years. They knew every face in the quarters, every routine, every rule. They believed the system was permanent, unchangeable. They were wrong, but they did not know that yet. Brent drank from a flask between patrols. Cole grew distracted near sunset, watching a hawk circle overhead. Harker fell asleep on his horse twice. Mara noted everything. When the evening bell rang, she returned to her cabin. Jonas was already there, sitting on the floor with a piece of charcoal, drawing pictures on a scrap of wood. He looked up when she entered, his face brightening. "Mama." She set down her satchel and ran her hand over his hair. "Did you eat?" "Yes, Mom. Miss Ruth gave me cornbread." That was kind of her. She prepared a simple meal of beans and dried fish, letting Jonas talk about his day while she worked. He told her about a beetle he found with green wings like jewels, about how he helped carry water to the fields, about a song one of the older women sang while they worked. She listened and asked questions and smiled when appropriate. Inside, her mind was already elsewhere. After they ate, she washed the dishes and helped Jonas prepare for bed. She sang him a quiet song, something her own mother had sung to her long ago. When his breathing deepened into sleep, she finally allowed herself to move. She lit a single candle and sat at the rough wooden table. From her satchel, she retrieved the small bundles of herbs she had gathered. Foxglove, hemlock, oleander, nightshade. She began to sort them, separating leaves from stems, grinding some into powder, steeping others in small amounts of water. Her hands moved with practiced certainty. No hesitation, no wasted motion. She thought about the supply shed, the sleeping quarters, the root cellar, the positions of the overseers, their patterns, their weaknesses. She thought about the distance to the marsh and which paths would be least watched at night. She thought about timing and distraction and how 17 men could be made to fall if pushed in exactly the right sequence. The candle burned lower. Shadows gathered in the corners of the cabin. Mara worked until her preparations were complete. Small clay jars sealed with wax, bundles wrapped in cloth and tied with careful knots. Everything organized, everything ready. She sat back and looked at the array before her. 72 hours, 3 days. She reached forward and pinched the candle flame between her fingers. Darkness swallowed the cabin whole. The darkness before dawn held a particular quality of stillness. No birdsong yet. No movement in the quarters. Just the soft rhythm of Jonas's breathing and the distant creak of the plantation settling into itself. Mara opened her eyes. She had not really slept. Her mind had spent the night turning over details like stones in a riverbed, examining each one for sharpness and weight. Now she rose from the thin mattress without a sound, her bare feet finding the floor with careful precision. Jonas stirred slightly but did not wake. She stood for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his small chest, then moved to the table where her satchel waited. The plan existed in her mind as a series of connected actions. Each step would create the conditions for the next. 17 overseers. 17 men who believed themselves untouchable. She would prove them wrong, not through confrontation, but through knowledge, through observation, through the systematic exploitation of every weakness they had shown her over the years. First, she needed to confirm her materials. The herbs she had prepared last night were a beginning, but she would need more. Different varieties for different purposes. Some to cloud judgment, some to induce deep sleep, some to cause temporary paralysis that might look like natural illness. She needed enough quantity to work with certainty, and she needed to gather it all without raising suspicion. She pulled on her work dress, the rough fabric familiar against her skin. From a small wooden box beneath the table, she retrieved a thin knife used for harvesting roots. She wrapped it in cloth and tucked it into her satchel, alongside the clay jars from the night before. Then she checked the door. Still dark outside, still quiet. She stepped into the pre-dawn air. The path to the eastern woods was one she walked often for legitimate healing work. Willow bark grew near the creek for pain relief. Wild ginger root helped with stomach ailments. Yarrow could stop bleeding. She knew every plant in these woods, knew which were helpful and which were harmful, and which could be either depending on preparation and dose. This morning she moved deeper into the undergrowth than usual. Foxglove grew in thick clusters, where the canopy opened to let in scattered light. She had already gathered some, but she needed more. The leaves contained compounds that could slow a heart, make a man dizzy and weak. In the right amount, it might look like sudden illness. She knelt and began harvesting, selecting only the healthiest leaves, wrapping them carefully in cloth. Water hemlock stood near the marshy ground where the creek widened. Dangerous. Even touching it required care. She used the cloth to protect her fingers as she cut several stalks, placing them in a separate section of her satchel. This one she would save. This one was for certainty. By the time the first light touched the sky, she had gathered enough to fill 3 additional pouches. She retraced her steps toward the quarters, arriving just as other workers began to emerge for morning duties. No one questioned her. No one ever did. She was the healer. Of course, she would be gathering plants before dawn. That was her work. She returned to the cabin long enough to hide the new materials beneath the floorboard, where she kept her most potent medicines. Jonas was awake now, rubbing sleep from his eyes. She smiled at him and prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush while he dressed. They ate together in comfortable silence, and then she sent him off to his morning tasks with a kiss on his forehead. When he was gone, she allowed herself one moment of stillness, one breath to feel the weight of what she was preparing to do. Then she picked up her satchel and went to work. The fields were already filling with workers by the time she reached her usual station. The heat was building early today, pressing down with the promise of a miserable afternoon. Mara set up her supplies beneath the fallen oak and waited. Overseer Brent arrived on horseback, his face already flushed despite the early hour. He dismounted with the graceless heaviness of a man who had been drinking and would drink again. Clear's throat. His boots hit the ground hard. He immediately began shouting at a group of workers who had not moved quickly enough to suit him. "Get to it. You think the cotton picks itself?" Mara watched from the corner of her eye while organizing her bandages. Brent worked the eastern fields, which meant he would remain in this area for most of the day. She had observed him for years. He drank throughout his shift from a flask he kept in his coat. By afternoon, his movements would grow sloppy. By evening, he would be barely functional. By sunset, he would retire to the overseer's quarters and drink himself into unconsciousness. She had counted it dozens of times. The pattern never varied. He would be the easiest. Mid-morning brought a steady stream of minor injuries. A woman with blisters on her palms from the hoe. A young man who had stepped on a nail that went through his worn shoe. An older worker with a persistent cough that would not clear. Mara treated each one with the same calm efficiency. Her hands steady, her voice quiet. She advised rest when possible. She applied salves and wrapped wounds. She listened to complaints and offered what comfort she could. But part of her mind was always elsewhere, always calculating. Around noon, one of the house servants came running to find her. There had been an accident in the main house. A kitchen worker had burned her arm badly on a cooking pot. Mara was needed immediately. She gathered her supplies and followed the servant up to the main house, through the back entrance reserved for enslaved workers. The kitchen was filled with smoke and the smell of burned meat. The injured woman sat on a stool, cradling her arm and crying softly. The burn was severe, blistering already, covering most of her forearm. "Let me see," Mara said gently, kneeling beside her. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound with cool water, applying a thick poultice of comfrey and plantain to draw out the heat. She wrapped the arm in clean linen and instructed the woman to keep it elevated. The kitchen overseer, a thin white woman named Mrs. Crenshaw, watched with her arms crossed. "Will she be able to work?" Mrs. Crenshaw asked. "Not for several days. The burn needs time to heal." Mrs. Crenshaw made a disgusted sound but did not argue. Mara was allowed to finish her work. As she packed her supplies, she noticed the door to the storage room stood open. Inside, she could see shelves lined with tools, knives of various sizes, lengths of rope, a small hatchet, metal files, items that might be useful for purposes beyond cooking. She committed the layout to memory. On her way out, she passed through the yard between the main house and the barn. Two workers were repairing a section of fence, and she overheard their conversation as she walked past. "Whole west wall of that barn is ready to come down," one of them said, driving a post into the ground. "Told the master 3 times now. Termites ate through the support beam. He don't care unless it affects his money directly." It will when the whole thing collapses and kills his stored equipment. Maybe then he'll listen. Mara kept walking, but she absorbed every word. The barn's west wall, termite damage, structural weakness. She filed it away with the rest. The afternoon passed in a blur of heat and repetitive motion. She treated more workers. She gathered more herbs during a brief break, this time focusing on plants that grew near the barn itself. And she watched, always watched. Cole, the second overseer, made his rounds with mechanical precision. Harker dozed in the shade near the horse pen. 17 men, but they were not vigilant. They were comfortable, complacent. They had never had reason to fear. That would be their undoing. When the evening bell finally rang, Mara packed her satchel and made her way back to the cabin. Jonas was already there, playing with a small carved horse one of the workers had made for him. She prepared dinner while he told her about his day, about the work he had done hauling water, about a butterfly he had seen with wings like painted glass. She listened and responded and acted as though everything was normal. After they ate, she pulled out an old blanket and sat with Jonas on the floor. "Let me tell you a story," she said, and began weaving a tale about a clever rabbit who outwitted a fox through patience and planning. Jonas listened with wide eyes, occasionally asking questions, laughing at the right moments. While she spoke, her hands worked steadily, sewing a small cloth pouch with tight, even stitches. The kind of pouch that could hold tools without making noise, the kind that could be concealed beneath clothing. When Jonas finally grew sleepy, she helped him into bed and sang the same song as the night before. His eyes closed, his breathing deepened. She waited until she was certain he would not wake. Then she stood and moved to the table. She retrieved the pouch she had been sewing, now complete, and filled it with several small items: the thin knife, a length of twine, a small metal file she had quietly taken from the kitchen storage room when Mrs. Crenshaw was not looking. She tucked the pouch into her dress and slipped out into the night. The moon was a thin crescent, providing barely enough light to see. Mara moved along the edge of the quarters, keeping to the shadows, her footsteps silent on the packed earth. She knew which paths the night patrol took. She knew their timing. Right now, they would be on the far side of the plantation, checking the road and the main gate. She had perhaps 20 minutes. The barn loomed ahead, a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. She approached from the south, where the trees grew close enough to provide cover. The west wall was exactly where the workers had said. She ran her hand along the wooden planks, feeling for weakness. The wood felt soft in places, crumbling slightly under pressure. She pushed gently. The entire section shifted. She knelt and examined the base where the support beams met the ground. Termite damage, yes, but also rot from years of moisture. The structural integrity was severely compromised. It would not take much. A deliberate push in the right location. Perhaps some additional weight applied at a strategic angle. The whole section could come down with relatively little effort. And if someone happened to be standing in the wrong place when it fell. She tested several points along the wall, memorizing which beams were weakest, which angles would cause the most catastrophic collapse. Then she stepped back and studied the surrounding area. There was a stack of old equipment nearby. Barrels, broken wagon wheels, items that could be repositioned to create obstacles or distractions. Everything was falling into place. She heard voices in the distance. The patrol returning early. She moved quickly back into the tree line, her heart steady despite the risk. By the time the two overseers passed the barn, she was already gone. A shadow among shadows. She returned to the cabin well after midnight. Jonas still slept soundly. She removed the pouch from her dress, and hid it with the rest of her preparations beneath the floorboard. Then she sat at the table in the darkness, her hands folded in front of her. Tomorrow evening, she whispered to herself. The first phase begins tomorrow evening. The morning arrived with the same oppressive heat as every other. Mara rose before Jonas as always and prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and water. Her hands moved through the familiar motions without thought, but her mind was already deep into the calculations of the day ahead. Phase 1. Disruption and isolation. She had identified the patterns. Now she needed to exploit them. Jonas ate quietly, still half asleep, his small fingers wrapped around the wooden spoon. She watched him for a moment, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the way his hair stuck up on one side where he had slept on it. 60 hours remained before he would be sold. 60 hours to execute a plan that could not fail. "Mama, are you all right?" Jonas asked, looking up at her with concern. She realized she had been staring. She forced a smile. "I'm fine, baby. Just thinking about the work today." He seemed to accept this and returned to his breakfast. When they finished, she walked him to the edge of the quarters, where the other children gathered for their assigned tasks. She kissed his forehead and watched him join the group, then turned toward the fields where her own work waited. The morning passed in careful observation. Mara moved through the plantation with deliberate purpose, treating injuries as they occurred, but always watching, always tracking. Brent spent his mornings in the eastern fields, supervising the cotton workers with his usual harsh efficiency. By mid-morning, he would move to the western fields to check progress there. He carried a flask that he drank from regularly, believing no one noticed. But Mara noticed everything. Cole maintained his position near the stables and equipment sheds, his meticulous nature keeping him focused on inventories and maintenance records. He walked the same route every 2 hours, checking locks and supplies with predictable precision. He trusted routine. He believed in order. That faith would be his weakness. Harker, the laziest of the 3 primary overseers, rotated between the quarters and the main house, ostensibly patrolling, but mostly finding shaded spots to rest. He preferred the north side of the property, where the oak trees grew thick and the breeze was strongest. He was also the most easily distracted, his attention drawn to any minor disruption or complaint. Mara began placing her markers. Nothing obvious. A small pile of stones arranged in a specific pattern near the path between the fields and the stables. A broken branch positioned at an angle near the quarters. A length of twine tied around a fence post at the edge of the property. These markers meant nothing to anyone else. But to Mara, they created a map, a way to track movement and timing, even when she could not see the overseers directly. By midday, she had confirmed the patterns she already knew. The overseers operated with mechanical predictability. They believed in the security of their authority. They never considered that someone might be studying them with the same attention a hunter gives to prey. The afternoon brought more injuries. A man with a deep splinter in his palm, a woman who had twisted her ankle stepping into a rut, a child with a fever that needed monitoring. Mara treated each case with her usual calm competence, but part of her attention remained fixed on the larger plan. She noted when the overseers changed shifts. She observed which ones gathered near the shared water barrel that stood in the shade between the equipment shed and the main barn. The barrel was refilled every morning, and the overseers drank from it throughout the day, especially in the evening, when the heat made men careless and thirsty. That barrel would serve her purpose well. When the evening bell rang and the fieldwork ended, Mara collected her supplies and made her way back to the cabin. She prepared supper for Jonas, listening to him talk about his day while her mind counted minutes and rehearsed movements. After they ate, she cleaned the dishes and helped him prepare for bed. She sang the familiar song and waited until his breathing grew deep and even. Then she moved. The small pouch she had sewn was already packed with what she needed. The herbal mixture she had prepared over the past 2 days sat in a cloth, wrapped bundle. The dried leaves and roots ground into a fine powder. Not enough to kill, but enough to disorient. Enough to slow reflexes and muddle thinking. Enough to make men vulnerable. She slipped out of the cabin into the humid night. The air hung thick and still, carrying the smell of earth and distant rain. She moved along the familiar paths, keeping to the shadows, her footsteps silent. The night patrol would be making their first round, near the main gate. She had perhaps 15 minutes before they circled back. The water barrel stood where it always did, positioned for easy access by the overseers. Mara approached from the side, staying low, listening for any sound of movement. The plantation was quiet, except for the usual night sounds. Crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of settling wood. She removed the cloth bundle from her pouch and carefully opened it. The powder inside smelled bitter and earthy. She had tested the dosage 3 times using field mice she had trapped. Too little would have no effect. Too much would be immediately noticeable. She had calculated the precise amount needed for the volume of water in the barrel, accounting for how much would be consumed over the next few hours. She poured the powder into the barrel, watching it dissolve into the dark water. She used a long stick to stir gently, ensuring even distribution. Then she replaced the barrel's wooden cover and stepped back. The first phase had begun. She moved quickly back toward the quarters, but did not return to her cabin. Not yet. She needed to be ready for the next step. The livestock holding pen sat on the eastern edge of the property. A simple fenced enclosure where pigs and goats were kept overnight before being moved to pasture in the morning. The gate was secured with a basic rope latch. Mara waited in the darkness near the pen, counting time by her own heartbeat. She knew when the overseers typically drank from the barrel. She knew how long the mixture would take to affect them. She needed to create the distraction at precisely the right moment. An hour passed, then another. She heard voices from the direction of the overseers' quarters. Laughter, the sound of men settling in for the evening. Some would sleep soon. Others would remain on night patrol, but all of them would have drunk from the barrel at some point. She heard footsteps approaching. 2 overseers on patrol, moving along their usual route. She recognized their voices. Cole and another man named Patterson. They passed within 20 feet of where she crouched in the shadows, completely unaware of her presence. When they were gone, she moved to the holding pen and quietly untied the rope latch. The gates swung open. The animals inside stirred, confused by the sudden freedom. Mara picked up a handful of small stones and threw them into the pen, startling the pigs into motion. They began to squeal and run, pushing through the open gate into the yard beyond. Chaos erupted immediately. The animals scattered in different directions, their squeals and the sound of hooves on packed earth carrying across the plantation. Shouts rose from the overseers' quarters. Men emerged cursing, trying to understand what had happened. Lanterns were lit. Voices called for help rounding up the loose livestock. Mara slipped away from the pen before anyone could see her, moving toward the barn while the overseers were distracted. She could hear them organizing, some chasing the pigs toward the western fields, others trying to herd the goats back toward the enclosure. The confusion was exactly what she needed. The barn loomed ahead, dark and silent. She approached the weakened west wall, the section she had tested the night before. The support beams were already compromised. She had identified the specific points that needed additional pressure. She had gathered heavy stones earlier in the day and hidden them nearby beneath an old tarp. She began placing the stones carefully, wedging them against the base of the weakened beams, creating additional stress on the already failing structure. She worked quickly but precisely, knowing that each stone needed to be positioned exactly right to ensure the collapse would occur at the proper angle. Voices grew closer. The overseers were returning from chasing the livestock. She heard Brent's rough voice cursing about the animals. Another voice she did not recognize complained about feeling dizzy. A third man said something about needing to sit down. The mixture was working. Mara finished positioning the final stone and stepped back. The structure was ready. One strong push at the right point, and the entire section would come down. But she needed the overseers in position first. She moved around to the front of the barn and raised her voice.
"Pitching it to carry? Someone's running! I saw someone running toward the marsh!"
The words cut through the night. Overseers turned toward the sound. Lantern light swung in her direction. She made sure to be visible for just a moment before darting toward the back of the barn, leading them exactly where she needed them.
"There!
Around the barn!" Footsteps followed her, heavy boots on dirt, men calling to each other. She counted 4 distinct voices, maybe 5. They were converging on the barn's west side, exactly as planned. She positioned herself behind a stack of old barrels and waited, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The overseers rounded the corner of the barn, their movements sluggish from the mixture, but still determined. They spread out along the west wall, searching for the supposed runaway. Mara gripped one of the heavy stones and threw it hard against the weakest support beam. The impact echoed in the night. The beam groaned. Then everything happened at once. The support beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The others, already stressed beyond their capacity, gave way in rapid succession. The entire west wall shifted, tilted, and collapsed inward with a tremendous crash that seemed to shake the ground itself. Dust billowed up in a choking cloud. Wood splintered and shrieked. The sound of impact was followed by silence, then by groans and cries from beneath the rubble. Mara did not wait to see more. She ran, moving low and fast through the darkness, her lungs burning as she pushed herself toward the quarters. Behind her, voices were already shouting, calling for help, trying to understand what had happened. Lanterns swung wildly. Confusion reigned. She reached her cabin and slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as possible. Her hands shook as she hid the pouch beneath the floorboard again. Jonas still slept, undisturbed by the distant commotion. She sat on the edge of her own bed, forcing her breathing to slow, her heart to calm. The night was not over. There would be investigations, questions. But for now, she had succeeded in the first phase. Several overseers were injured or worse beneath that collapsed wall. The others were disoriented from the mixture in the water. Communication was disrupted. Order was breaking down. And tomorrow night, she would continue. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over the Ellington plantation. Mara woke to shouting in the distance. Men's voices raised in alarm and confusion. She rose carefully, checking Jonas first. He still slept, his small chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She moved to the window and looked toward the barn. Men gathered around the collapsed structure, some pulling at debris, others standing back with their arms crossed. Even from this distance, Mara could see the dust still hanging in the morning air, the jagged remains of the west wall jutting up like broken teeth. She dressed quickly and stepped outside. Other enslaved workers emerged from their cabins, talking in low voices, their faces carefully neutral. No one knew what had happened. No one asked questions that could draw attention. Terrible accident. An older woman named Ruth said quietly as she passed Mara. They say several men were trapped inside. Mara nodded but said nothing. She walked toward the main house with her medicine bag, maintaining her usual routine. If she changed her behavior now, someone might notice. She had to be exactly who she always was. The atmosphere on the plantation felt different today, tighter, more watchful. Overseers moved in pairs instead of alone. Their faces were hard with suspicion and exhaustion. Mara saw Cole standing near the main house, deep in conversation with Charles Ellington. The master's expression was thunderous. 17 years I've run this plantation, Charles said, his voice carrying across the yard. Nothing like this has ever happened. A barn doesn't just collapse. Someone must have been careless with the maintenance. Cole nodded, but his eyes scanned the grounds constantly. We'll inspect every structure. Make sure nothing else is compromised. Mara kept her head down and continued toward the infirmary. A field worker had cut his hand that morning and needed it dressed. She worked slowly and carefully, her hand steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. Through the window, she could see more overseers gathering near the barn. They pointed at the debris, arguing about what had caused the collapse. By midday, Charles had issued new orders. Patrols would be doubled. No one would move around the plantation after dark without explicit permission. Any suspicious activity would be reported immediately. The overseers received these instructions with grim determination, their earlier complacency replaced by nervous energy. Mara understood what this meant. The increased security would make her next steps more dangerous. But it also created opportunity. When men were tense and exhausted, they made mistakes. They saw threats where none existed. They could be manipulated. She spent the afternoon moving through her usual duties, but her mind worked constantly, adjusting her plans. The stable equipment would be easy to sabotage. She had noticed several days ago that the leather straps on the saddle rack were already worn thin. A few strategic cuts in the right places would weaken them further. And the smokehouse ladder, used daily by overseers checking the hanging meat, had loose nails she had identified earlier that week. After supper, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Mara returned to her cabin. Jonas was quiet, drawing in his small journal with a piece of charcoal. She watched him for a moment, memorizing the curve of his shoulders, the way he bit his lower lip when he concentrated. He said without looking up. Why is everyone scared today? Sometimes accidents happen, Mara said carefully. The grown folks are just making sure everyone stays safe. Jonas nodded and returned to his drawing. Mara waited until he was absorbed again, then slipped out into the fading light. The stable was empty, most of the horses already in their stalls for the evening. Mara moved to the saddle rack and examined the leather straps. She pulled a small knife from her pouch and made careful incisions along the stress points, ensuring they would snap under weight, but not immediately. The work took only minutes. Next, she approached the smokehouse. The ladder leaned against its side, old wood weathered by years of use. She knelt and examined the bottom rungs, finding the nails she had spotted earlier. Using a flat stone, she worked them loose bit by bit until they barely held the wood together. From a distance, the ladder looked solid, but any significant weight would tear it apart. Darkness settled over the plantation like a blanket. Mara could hear the overseers beginning their patrols, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. She needed to draw them to specific locations. She needed them to investigate the areas she had prepared. She walked carefully to the storage shed and placed a lantern just inside the doorway, lighting it so the flame flickered visibly through the gap. Then she moved to the soft earth near the shed and used a stick to create footprints, leading away toward the smokehouse. The prints were shallow and indistinct, but visible enough to suggest someone had been there recently. She retreated to the shadows and waited. The first patrol came within 20 minutes. 2 overseers, one carrying a torch, the other a rifle. They spotted the flickering lantern immediately and moved toward it with weapons raised. "Someone's been here," one of them said, examining the footprints. "These are fresh." They followed the trail toward the smokehouse. Mara watched from her hiding place as they approached the ladder. One of them pointed up toward the hanging meat. "Could be hiding up there," he said. The other overseer hesitated. "That ladder looks old. It's fine. I've used it a dozen times." He began to climb. The first rung held, the second. On the third, the wood cracked with a sharp sound. The overseer grabbed for support, but the entire ladder came apart beneath him. He fell backward with a shout of surprise, landing hard on the packed earth. The other overseer rushed to help him, but as he moved, his boot caught on a loose board Mara had positioned earlier. He stumbled forward, striking his head against the smokehouse wall with a dull thud. Both men lay still. The torch had fallen and extinguished itself in the dirt. Mara forced herself to breathe, to think. She had known this would happen. She had planned for it. But seeing the result made her stomach twist. With something that felt like both triumph and horror, she started to move back toward the quarters when she heard voices from the main house. Loud voices, angry voices. She crept closer, staying in the shadows until she could make out words. "I already sent the boy ahead," Charles Ellington was saying. "I'm not taking any chances with this chaos. Warren's place is safer until we sort out what's happening here." Mara's blood turned to ice. The boy, Jonas, they had already moved him. "When?" another voice asked. "This afternoon, while everyone was distracted with the barn. He's halfway to Warren's by now." Mara pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. They had taken Jonas early. Her entire timeline had collapsed. Everything she had planned was suddenly meaningless. If her son was already gone, she turned and ran back to her cabin, moving as quickly as she dared in the darkness. Inside, she found it empty. Jonas's journal lay on the table, his drawings scattered across the surface. A small bag of his clothes was missing. They had taken him while she was sabotaging the ladder, while she was executing her plan, while she was trying to save him. Mara sank onto the bed, her vision blurring with tears she could not afford to shed. But she forced herself to stop to think. Jonas was alive. He was on a wagon headed to Warren Ellington's plantation. She still had time. She still had options. But she could not stay here. Not now, with the overseers dead or injured, with the plantation in chaos. The investigation would intensify. They would search everyone, question everyone. Her window of escape was closing rapidly. She gathered her materials quickly. The herbs, the knife, what little food she had. She wrapped everything in a cloth bundle and tied it securely. Then she took Jonas's journal and pressed it against her chest for a moment before adding it to the bundle. The marsh lay beyond the eastern fields, a wild tangle of water and vegetation that most people avoided. But Mara had walked its edges before, gathering certain plants that grew only in wet soil. She knew the paths. She knew where the water was shallow enough to cross. She left the cabin as the first hints of dawn touched the sky. Behind her, shouts were rising again as the night's casualties were discovered. Soon they would realize she was missing. Soon they would search. But by then, Mara would be deep in the marsh, moving toward a destination she had not yet fully imagined. Moving toward her son. The tall grass swallowed her as she ran. The morning mist rose around her like smoke, and the plantation, with all its violence and grief, began to fade behind her into the gray light of a new day. The sunrise caught Mara off guard. She had been moving through darkness for so long that the sudden appearance of light over the water felt almost violent. The marsh stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of shallow channels and tangled vegetation that seemed to shift with each step she took. Her feet were wet, her skirt heavy with mud and brackish water. The bundle she carried felt heavier with each passing hour. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of bells. The plantation was awake. They had discovered what she had done. The bells rang in a pattern. She recognized 3 short bursts, a pause, then 3 more. A signal for emergency. A call for help from neighboring estates. Mara pushed deeper into the reeds, forcing her exhausted body to keep moving. The tall grass cut at her hands and arms, leaving thin red lines across her skin. The ground beneath her feet alternated between solid earth and sucking mud that tried to trap her with each step. She had walked through the edges of this marsh before, but never this deep, never this far from familiar landmarks. The sun climbed higher, turning the mist into thick, humid air that clung to everything. Sweat mixed with marsh water on Mara's face. Her lungs burned from the effort of breathing in the heavy atmosphere. Several times she heard voices in the distance, searchers calling to one another, and she would freeze in place until the sounds faded. By midday, her body gave her no choice but to rest. She found a cluster of ancient cypress trees whose massive trunks created a small island of relatively dry ground. Their roots formed a natural shelter, and Mara crawled between them, collapsing against the rough bark. She pulled the bundle close to her chest and allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. Sleep tried to take her, but fear kept her hovering at its edge. Jonas's face appeared in her mind, his quiet concentration as he drew in his journal. Where was he now? Was he frightened? Did he know she was coming for him? The sound of footsteps on water made her eyes snap open. A man stood several yards away, watching her. He was older, perhaps 50, with gray threading through his dark hair and beard. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried a walking stick that he used to test the ground before each step. His eyes were cautious, but not hostile. Mara's hand went to the knife in her bundle. "Easy," the man said, raising his free hand. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Isaac. I don't need help," Mara said, her voice rough from hours of silence. "Everyone in this marsh needs help," Isaac replied. "The question is whether you're willing to accept it." Behind him, 2 more figures appeared through the reeds. A younger woman with sharp eyes, and a man about Isaac's age, who carried a fishing net over his shoulder. They positioned themselves at angles that weren't quite threatening, but made it clear they could surround her if necessary. "Who are you?" Mara asked. "We're called the Tide Makers," Isaac said. "We help people who need to disappear. People running from places they should never have been held in the first place." Mara studied his face, looking for deception. She found only wariness and a kind of patient resolve. "The plantation bells are ringing," she said. "They're searching." "We heard," Isaac replied. "Which plantation?" "Ellington." Something shifted in Isaac's expression. "Charles Ellington's place, the one where the overseers—" He stopped himself. "How long have you been running?" "Since before dawn." "And before that?" Mara hesitated. The truth felt too dangerous to speak aloud. "I worked in the healing house. I fled when I had the chance." Isaac nodded slowly, as if deciding whether to believe her. "You must be thirsty," he said finally, "and hungry. We have clean water and food at our camp. It's not far." "I need to keep moving," Mara said. "Moving where?" "The search parties know this marsh. They have dogs. If you keep running alone, they'll find you by nightfall." Isaac took a careful step closer. Come with us. Rest for a few hours. Then we'll help you decide your next move. The younger woman spoke for the first time. We've pulled 37 people out of these marshes in the past year. Not one has been caught. We know what we're doing. Mara looked at each of them in turn. Every instinct told her to trust no one, to rely only on herself. But exhaustion was making her vision blur at the edges. Her legs trembled when she tried to stand. And somewhere ahead, Jonas waited, held as bait in a trap she could not spring alone. A few hours, she said. Isaac's shoulders relaxed slightly. That's all we ask. They led her through channels she would never have found on her own, following paths that seemed to disappear and reappear as the water level shifted. The older man with the fishing net walked ahead, using a long pole to test depth. The younger woman stayed behind Mara, not pushing, but clearly ensuring she did not change direction. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, they reached a place where the marsh opened into a wider channel. A collection of small boats was tied to cypress stumps, and beyond them, partially hidden by hanging moss and carefully positioned branches, stood a camp. Several rough shelters had been built on platforms above the waterline. A cooking fire burned in a carefully contained pit. Perhaps a dozen people moved through the space, some mending nets, others preparing food. Welcome to the only free ground in 50 miles, Isaac said. They gave Mara a tin cup of clean water and a bowl of fish stew thick with vegetables. She ate slowly, trying not to show how desperately hungry she was. The other residents of the camp watched her with curiosity, but did not approach. They understood the need for privacy, for time to adjust. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Isaac sat down across from her. There are stories coming out of Ellington's plantation, he said quietly. Strange stories. Mara kept her expression neutral. What kind of stories? 17 overseers dead, some in accidents, some in ways that don't quite make sense. Barn collapse, ladder failure, poisoned water. Isaac studied her face. The white folks are calling it a curse. Some think it was an uprising that failed. Others say it was one person working alone. What do you think? Mara asked. I think 17 overseers don't die in one night without someone very smart and very desperate making it happen. Isaac leaned forward slightly. I also think the person who did it probably had a reason that mattered more than their own life. Mara said nothing. There's another rumor, Isaac continued, that a woman who worked in the healing house survived the chaos. Some reports say she died, others say she ran. Charles Ellington is offering a reward for information about her whereabouts. Why tell me this? Mara asked. Because you need to understand what you're walking into, if you plan to keep moving. Isaac paused. And because I think you need to know that your son was moved yesterday afternoon to Warren Ellington's plantation, 30 miles northwest of here. The world seemed to stop. Mara's hands tightened around the bowl. How do you know about Jonas? We have contacts. People who work in the big houses, who overhear conversations. Warren Ellington sent a wagon for the boy yesterday. He's using him as bait, hoping the mother will try to retrieve him. Isaac's voice was gentle but firm. They're expecting you. The plantation is fortified. Extra guards. New protocols. They know someone is coming. Mara closed her eyes, fighting the wave of despair that threatened to pull her under. Jonas was alive. That was what mattered. But he was also a trap, carefully laid and heavily guarded. I have to go to him, she said. I know, Isaac replied. But not like this. Not exhausted and alone and walking into their hands. He reached out and placed his hand on the table between them. Let us help you. Let me help you. I've spent 20 years fighting this system. I know how to move through it. I know how to plan. Mara looked at him, this stranger who seemed to see through every wall she had built around herself. "Why would you help me?" "Because 17 overseers dead means the system is afraid," Isaac said simply. "And when they're afraid, they make mistakes. And because no child should be used as bait for their mother." Around them, the camp continued its quiet evening routines. Somewhere in the distance, birds called to one another across the water. The cooking fire crackled and sent up thin streams of smoke that disappeared into the gathering darkness. Mara set down the bowl and met Isaac's eyes. "Tell me about Warren Ellington's plantation," she said. Mara woke before dawn to find Isaac already awake, sitting cross-legged near the dying embers of the fire. The marsh was quiet, except for the occasional splash of water and the low murmur of wind through the cypress trees. She had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of Jonas sitting alone in an unfamiliar room, waiting for her. Isaac looked up as she approached. "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing to a battered pot warming near the coals. "Please," Mara said. He poured her a cup and handed it over. The liquid was bitter and strong, nothing like the weak tea she had been allowed on the plantation. It burned going down, but cleared some of the fog from her mind. "I need to learn," Mara said without preamble. "Whatever you can teach me. I have to reach Jonas, and I won't get a second chance if I fail the first time." Isaac nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. "What you did at Ellington's plantation took intelligence and careful planning. But what you're proposing now is different. You'll be walking into a fortified space where people are actively looking for someone exactly like you." "I know. Do you?" Isaac set down his own cup and stood. "Because the difference between planning an escape and planning an infiltration is this: when you escape, you only need to succeed once. When you infiltrate, you need to succeed at every single moment until you're back out again. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they'll have you. Then teach me not to make mistakes," Mara said. Isaac studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Come with me." He led her away from the camp to a denser section of marsh, where the water was shallow and the vegetation grew thick. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. "First lesson," Isaac said, "movement. Most people think hiding means staying still. But that only works if you're already in position. When you need to cover ground, you have to move like you belong exactly where you are." He demonstrated, walking through the marsh with measured steps that barely disturbed the water. His posture was relaxed but purposeful, like a man going about ordinary business. Mara followed his example, trying to match his rhythm. "Too careful," Isaac said. "You're moving like someone who's trying not to be seen. That's exactly what draws attention. Move like you have every right to be there, like you're tired from a long day of work and just want to finish your task and rest." Mara adjusted, letting her shoulders slump slightly. Her steps became more mechanical. It felt wrong exposing herself this way, but she understood the logic. Someone skulking through shadows looked suspicious. Someone simply going about their duties was invisible. They practiced for hours. Isaac taught her how to use her peripheral vision, instead of turning her head to look directly at things. How to time her movements with natural sounds. A gust of wind, the call of birds that would mask any noise she made. How to position herself so that even if someone looked in her direction, their eyes would slide past her toward something more visually interesting. "You already know how to observe," Isaac said during a brief rest. "I watched you yesterday. You took in every detail of this camp within minutes of arriving. But there's a difference between observation and tactical awareness. You need to know not just what's there, but what it means for your next 3 moves." He pointed to a path through the marsh. Tell me what you see. Mara looked carefully. Shallow water. Firm ground on the left side. Overhanging branches that would provide cover. A clear sight line to that cypress tree about 40 yards ahead. Good. Now tell me what that means if you're trying to move through quickly. Mara thought. The shallow water means I can move faster, but it also means I'll leave clearer tracks. The firm ground is safer but more exposed. The branches provide cover from above, but could catch on clothing. The sight line means anyone at the cypress tree could spot me before I spot them. Better, Isaac said. No, tell me how you'd actually move through. I'd use the firm ground, but stay close to the vegetation. Move during wind gusts to mask sound. Stop before reaching the sight line and observe the cypress tree for several minutes before proceeding. If I saw anyone, I'd wait until they moved on or find an alternate route. Isaac smiled. You learn fast. They returned to camp as the sun reached its highest point. The younger woman Mara had met the previous day approached with a bundle of clothing. Isaac said you'd need these, she said, handing them over. Mara unfolded the bundle to find a simple dress made of rough cotton. Darker than the one she wore, but not so dark it would stand out. A clean head wrap, a worn shawl, and a leather pouch that smelled faintly of herbs. The dress belonged to someone who passed through last month. The woman explained. She made it north safely and didn't need it anymore. The pouch is empty, but it's been used for healing work before. It'll smell right if anyone checks. Thank you, Mara said. There's soap and a bucket of water behind the third shelter. You should wash and change before evening. Isaac wants you looking like you've been traveling for work, not running for your life. Mara cleaned herself as well as she could with cold water and harsh soap, scrubbing away the marsh mud and dried sweat. She changed into the new clothes and practiced, wrapping the headscarf the way traveling workers did, low across her forehead and tied at the back of her neck. When she looked at her reflection in a still pool of water, she barely recognized herself. The woman looking back appeared older, harder, more weathered by ordinary labor than by desperate flight. Isaac was waiting with maps when she returned. He had spread several pieces of paper across a makeshift table, weighting the corners with stones. Warren Ellington's plantation is here, he said, pointing to a marked location 30 miles northwest along the river. It's smaller than Charles's operation, but better organized. Warren is a businessman first. He runs a tight operation. Mara studied the maps, committing every detail to memory. The roads, the waterways, the marked locations of known slave catcher camps, the safe houses that weren't really safe anymore. Isaac had marked everything in careful detail, the product of years of accumulated knowledge. We'll travel by canoe tonight, Isaac continued. The river route is longer but safer than the roads. We should reach the plantation by tomorrow afternoon. You'll approach as a traveling healer, visiting to treat sick field workers. I've sent word ahead through our network. The head house servant knows to expect someone, though she doesn't know it's you. And you? Mara asked. I'll create a distraction on the eastern edge of the property. Something that draws attention, but doesn't seem connected to your presence. A small fire, maybe, or a report of fugitives spotted in the woods. Something that pulls the guards away from the main house and quarters. They worked through the plan until darkness fell, refining each step, identifying potential problems, building in contingencies. After a simple dinner of cornbread and greens, the camp settled into its evening routines. Mara sat alone near the water, a scrap of paper and a pencil stub borrowed from Isaac resting in her lap. She stared at the blank page for a long time before beginning to write. Jonas, if I cannot reach you, know that I tried. Know that every choice I made was to bring you home. You are braver than any child should have to be. Stay strong a little longer. Your mother." She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her medical pouch. A message she hoped she would never need to leave. Isaac found her as the moon rose. "It's time to rest," he said. "We have a long journey ahead." Mara nodded and followed him back to the shelter. She lay down on the rough blanket they had provided, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind kept circling back to Jonas, imagining the moment she would see him again, planning the words she would say, the way she would hold him. When she finally dozed, it was shallow and restless. She woke to Isaac's gentle touch on her shoulder. The camp was still dark. The pre-dawn air cool and damp. Other tide makers were already moving quietly through their morning tasks, preparing the boats, checking supplies. Mara stood and gathered her few possessions, the medical pouch, the folded message, the knife she had carried from Ellington's plantation. Now hidden in a pocket Isaac had sewn into her dress. The canoe waited at the water's edge, long and narrow, built for silence and speed. Isaac loaded their supplies while Mara settled herself in the front. Another tide maker handed her a paddle. "Current's with you until the bend," he said quietly. "After that, you'll be working against it. Stay close to the bank where the water's slower." Isaac climbed into the back of the canoe, and they pushed off from the shore. The boat glided forward smoothly, barely disturbing the dark water. Around them, the marsh began to wake, birds calling softly to one another, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowing its territorial claim. They paddled in silence, their strokes synchronized, the canoe cutting through the water like a knife through cloth. Behind them, the tide maker camp disappeared into the morning mist. Ahead lay 30 miles of river, a fortified plantation, and a sun who was waiting. The sky was still gray with pre-dawn light when Isaac guided the canoe toward a narrow landing hidden by drooping willow branches. They had paddled through the night, stopping only twice to rest their arms and drink from their water skins. Mara's shoulders ached, but she pushed the discomfort away. There would be time for pain later. Isaac pulled the canoe onto the muddy bank, and together they lifted it, carrying it deep into the undergrowth, where it wouldn't be visible from the water. He covered it with fallen branches and Spanish moss, his movements efficient and practiced. "From here we walk," he said quietly. "The main road is a quarter-mile east. You'll approach from there as if you've been traveling overland. I'll circle around to the eastern property line and wait for your signal." Mara nodded. She adjusted the medical pouch at her hip and straightened the head wrap that marked her as a traveling healer. The dress she wore was dusty from their journey, which was good. It made her story more believable. They walked through the woods in silence, picking their way over roots and around thick palmetto stands. When they reached the edge of the tree line, Isaac touched her arm. "Remember," he said, "you're not a mother looking for her son. You're a healer offering services. Your value is professional, not personal. I understand. When you find him, don't react. Don't let anyone see what he means to you." Mara met his eyes. "I know what I have to do." Isaac studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I'll wait for dark. When you see smoke from the eastern shed, that's your signal to move. Get Jonas and head for the cane fields. I'll meet you at the old mill foundation we'd marked on the map." He disappeared back into the woods before she could respond. Mara took a breath and stepped onto the road. She walked with steady purpose. Not hurried, but not leisurely either. Just a woman with work to do. Traveling between plantations as healers, sometimes did when their skills were needed elsewhere. Warren Ellington's plantation appeared around a bend in the road. It was smaller than Charles's estate, but more orderly. The main house sat on a slight rise, painted white with black shutters. Below it, the quarters stretched in neat rows. Fields extended in every direction, the cotton plants already tall and full. An overseer waited at the main gate, a thick man with a red face and a rifle resting across his knees. He watched Mara approach with the bored suspicion of someone who had stood guard too many days in a row. "Help you?" he asked. Mara kept her voice calm and professional. "I'm a healer. Heard tell you got fever spreading through the field workers. I've treated similar outbreaks on other plantations. Thought I might offer my services." The overseer's eyes narrowed. "Nobody sent for you. Nobody had to. Word travels. Sick workers don't pick cotton. If I can get them back in the fields faster, that seems like it benefits everyone." He considered this. Mara could see him working through the calculation. Suspicious of outsiders, yes, but also aware that sick workers cost money, and she was just one woman with a bag of herbs. What threat could she pose? "Wait here," he finally said, standing. He walked toward the main house, and Mara waited in the morning heat, forcing herself to breathe slowly. After several minutes, a thin white man in a vest and wire spectacles emerged from the house with the overseer. He looked Mara over with the assessing gaze of someone who evaluated everything in terms of profit and loss. "You've treated fever outbreaks?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Swamp fever mostly, sometimes consumption. I know the herbs that bring down temperature and settle the stomach." "And your fee?" $2 for the day. $3 if I need to stay overnight." The man in the vest, likely Warren's estate manager, nodded slowly. "We've had 6 workers down since Tuesday. If you can get them back to work, I'll pay you $2. But you stay in the infirmary area. Don't wander. Don't talk to workers about anything except their treatment. Understood?" "Yes, sir." He gestured to the overseer. "Take her to the infirmary. Watch her." The overseer led Mara through the gate and down a dusty path between buildings. The infirmary was a long, low structure with a covered porch. Inside, 6 workers lay on narrow cots, their faces drawn with fever. Mara set down her medical pouch and began examining the first patient, a young man whose skin burned to the touch. She worked methodically, checking each person, asking questions, mixing remedies from the herbs in her bag. The overseer watched from the doorway, but after an hour of her quiet, competent work, he grew bored and wandered outside. She was treating the third patient when she heard children's voices from somewhere behind the building. Her hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work, wrapping a compress around a woman's forehead. But her mind was racing. Children meant a holding area, possibly a shed where they kept the youngest workers or those waiting to be reassigned. Midday arrived with brutal heat. Mara stepped onto the porch, wiping sweat from her face with her sleeve. The overseer had moved to a shaded area near the well, his attention on a group of field workers returning for their brief meal break. She circled the infirmary building as if checking for additional sick workers. Behind it stood several storage sheds and a small holding structure with barred windows. Through one of those windows, she saw him. Jonas. He was sitting on a wooden bench, his hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes. Mara's chest tightened painfully, but she kept walking, kept her expression neutral. She made a show of checking the other buildings, then returned to the infirmary as if she'd found nothing of interest. She waited until the overseer took his own meal break, leaving her alone with the patients. Then she slipped back outside and approached the holding shed from the side, where the angle of the building would hide her from casual observation.
"Jonas,"
she whispered through the bars. His head snapped up, For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then he crossed to the window, his small hands gripping the bars. "Mama," his voice cracked. "I'm here," she said softly. "I'm getting you out. Before nightfall, we leave. Do you understand?" He nodded, tears running down his face. "I knew you'd come. I told them you would. But they said..." "Don't listen to what they said. Just be ready. When you see smoke from the eastern sheds, find a way to get outside. Hide in the cane fields behind the quarters. I'll find you there." "Mama, they're watching everyone. They know someone's coming for me. They're using me as..." Footsteps approached. Mara stepped away from the window immediately, turning toward the well as if she'd been walking there all along. A different overseer passed by, barely glancing at her. She returned to the infirmary and continued her work, though her hands trembled slightly as she ground herbs for another fever remedy. The afternoon dragged with agonizing slowness. She treated the workers, answered the estate manager's questions about their conditions, accepted a plate of cornbread and greens for her supper. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, she positioned herself on the infirmary porch, where she could see the eastern edge of the plantation. She pretended to sort through her medical supplies while watching, waiting. The smoke appeared just as darkness gathered, thin at first, then thicker. Voices shouted in alarm. The overseer near the infirmary stood and squinted toward the disturbance. More shouts, the sound of running feet.
"Fire!"
someone yelled. Storage sheds burning. Guards rushed past, heading toward the smoke. Mara's heart hammered. She moved toward the holding shed, but before she could reach it, she heard the crack of a rifle shot. Then more shouting. Different now.
Angry and triumphant. "Got one!"
"We got one of them." Mara froze. "No, please, no." Guards dragged Isaac into view, his hands bound, blood running from a gash on his temple. The estate manager appeared, and even from a distance, Mara could see the cold satisfaction on his face. "Lock him in the smokehouse," the manager ordered. "Double the patrols. If there's one, there's more. Find them." Overseers fanned out across the plantation. Mara saw them converge on the holding shed where Jonas was kept. They pulled him out roughly, dragging him toward the main house. She couldn't reach him. Not now. Not with every guard on alert. A patrol headed toward the infirmary. Mara slipped inside and pressed herself against the wall behind the door, barely breathing. Through the window, she watched them search the area, their lanterns swinging in the darkness. Check everywhere. One of them barked. The boy said his mama was coming. She's here somewhere. They moved past, continuing their search. Mara waited until their voices faded, then crept to the back window of the infirmary. Beyond it lay rows of cotton plants, their leaves rustling in the night breeze. She climbed through the window and dropped into the soft earth below. Then she ran, staying low, moving between the cotton rows toward the cane fields beyond. Behind her, lanterns flickered, and voices called to one another, coordinating their search. She had lost Isaac. She had lost Jonas again, and now she was alone in the darkness with no plan and no hope, running through endless rows of cane that whispered accusations with every gust of wind. The darkness before dawn offered no comfort. Mara crouched between rows of sugar cane, her dress soaked through with dew, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Every sound made her flinch. The rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional shout from a patrol still searching the grounds. She had been running for hours. Her legs ached. Her feet were cut and bleeding from sharp cane stubble, but she couldn't stop moving. Not completely. If she stayed in one place too long, they would find her. The sky began to lighten in the east, turning from black to deep purple. Mara knew she needed shelter before full daylight exposed her. She had glimpsed something earlier during her escape. a structure beyond the fields, half hidden by overgrown brush. An old sugar mill, abandoned and forgotten. She moved through the cane with painful slowness, listening for patrols. The dawn chorus of birds began, masking smaller sounds, but also covering the noise of her movement. By the time the sun broke the horizon, she had reached the edge of the fields. The mill stood about 50 yards away across open ground. Its walls were weathered gray wood, several boards missing. The roof sagged dangerously. Weeds grew thick around its foundation. Mara waited in the cane, watching. No movement near the building. No sign anyone had been there in years. She studied the open ground between her hiding spot and the mill, calculating. If she ran, she would be exposed for perhaps 30 seconds. If anyone happened to look this direction at the wrong moment, they would see her. But she had no choice. The sun was rising. Soon the fields would be full of workers, and her chance would be gone. She ran. Her feet pounded the hard earth. The distance seemed to stretch impossibly long. She expected a shout, a gunshot, the sound of pursuit. But there was only her ragged breathing and the blood pounding in her ears. She reached the mill and pressed herself against its outer wall, gasping. After a moment, she found a gap between boards and slipped inside. The interior was dim and thick with dust. Broken machinery littered the floor. Rusted gears, collapsed wooden frames, piles of rotted rope. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating scattered pools of weak light. The smell of decay and old wood filled her nose. Mara moved to the far corner, where shadows were deepest and collapsed against the wall. Her body shook uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to steady her breathing. She had failed. Isaac was captured, probably already dead. Jonas was locked away again, more heavily guarded than before. And she was alone, hunted, with nowhere to go and no plan left. The morning passed in a haze of exhaustion and despair. Mara drifted in and out of consciousness, her body demanding rest even as her mind churned with guilt and fear. When she finally opened her eyes fully, the sun was high overhead, its light slanting through the broken roof in dusty beams. She pulled her medical pouch closer and began removing its contents mechanically. Herbs she would never use, bandages she would never apply, tools for healing that seemed laughable now. 17 overseers were dead because of her. She had killed them, not directly with her own hands perhaps, but through her planning, her manipulation, her strategic cruelty. She had told herself it was necessary, that they were monsters who deserved what happened. And maybe that was true. But they were still dead, and she was the one who had made it happen. And for what? Jonas was still enslaved. Isaac was captured. She was hiding in an abandoned mill, with no hope of rescue. Her hand brushed something small and hard in the bottom of the pouch. She pulled it out. A folded piece of paper, worn and creased. Jonas's journal message. The one she had written for him but never delivered. She had forgotten it was there. With shaking hands, she unfolded it. But the handwriting wasn't hers. Someone had written on the other side, "Mama, I know you'll come back. You always do. I'm not scared because I know you're the smartest person alive. I love you, Jonas." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She read them again and again. He believed in her. Even locked away, even used as bait, he still believed she would find a way. Mara wiped her eyes roughly and folded the paper, tucking it into her dress. Then she stood, her legs unsteady, but her mind beginning to clear. She had been thinking about this wrong. She had tried to be clever, tried to use tricks and manipulation. But what she needed now wasn't cleverness. It was strategy. Real strategy, the kind Isaac had started teaching her. She moved to the mill's entrance and peered through gaps in the boards. From here, she could see the plantation in the distance. The main house, the outbuildings, the fields stretching between. She watched for over an hour, studying everything. The guards rotated every 4 hours. She counted 6 patrols, each covering different sections of the property. They were thorough but predictable. They followed the same routes, checked the same buildings, met at the same central point to exchange information. The fence along the eastern edge was older than the rest. Its posts weathered and loose in several places. Not enough for a person to slip through easily, but enough to exploit if she had the right tools and timing. The workers moved between fields in groups, supervised but not constantly watched. They knew the grounds better than the guards did. If she could communicate with even a few of them, coordinate their movements. As afternoon faded toward evening, Mara's plan took shape. Not a desperate act of violence this time. Something more controlled, more strategic. She would create multiple distractions simultaneously, small fires in different locations that would force the guards to split up. While they responded to the fires, she would sabotage their central communication point, cutting them off from coordinating effectively. But the key was the workers themselves. If she could signal them, give them a reason to act together, even for just a few minutes, their collective movement would create chaos the guards couldn't contain. Not a rebellion exactly, just confusion, disorder, enough cover for her to reach Jonas. She wouldn't ask them to fight, wouldn't ask them to risk execution, just to move at the right moment, to be in the wrong places at the right time, to turn what should be a coordinated defense into scattered confusion. It would require perfect timing. It would require help from people who had no reason to trust her. It would require luck. But it might work. As darkness fell completely, Mara checked her remaining supplies. A knife, matches, 3 small bottles of lamp oil she had taken from the infirmary, strips of cloth that could serve as fuses. She wrapped everything carefully and secured the bundle to her body. Then she crept to the mill's entrance and looked out at the plantation, now dotted with lanterns as the night watch took their positions. She waited until the moon rose, a thin crescent that provided just enough light to navigate by. Then she slipped from the mill and moved through the darkness toward the plantation's eastern fence. The first stage of her plan was simple. Mark the weak points in the fence with small strips of cloth tied low to the ground, visible only to someone who knew to look for them. Create exit routes that others could use if they chose to. She worked quickly and silently, moving along the fence line like a shadow. Every few yards, she stopped and listened. Guard voices drifted on the night air, but they stayed distant. By midnight, she had marked 6 potential escape routes and positioned small bundles of kindling near 3 separate outbuildings, ready to ignite, but not yet lit. Stage 1 was complete. She retreated to a dense thicket near the eastern fields and crouched there, watching the plantation settle into its nighttime rhythm. Tomorrow, she would need to make contact with at least one worker. Someone she could trust with a simple message. Someone who understood that freedom sometimes required risk. Her hand touched the folded paper in her dress. Jonas's message, his belief in her. She would not fail him again. The drainage ditch smelled of rot and stagnant water. Mara lowered herself into it before dawn, the darkness still complete. Cold mud sucked at her feet with each step. She moved slowly, careful not to splash, following the channel as it curved toward the plantation's eastern edge. The ditch passed beneath the fence line through a rusted grate. Mara had noticed it during her earlier observation. Too small for most people to slip through, but she was thin from years of meager rations. She pushed her bundle of supplies ahead of her, then squeezed her body sideways through the opening. Metal scraped her shoulders and caught on her dress, She twisted, pulled, and finally broke through to the other side. She was inside the plantation grounds. The worker cabins sat in 2 rows ahead of her, dark and silent. Mara crept toward them, staying low. She knew the morning bell would ring soon. She had perhaps 20 minutes before people began stirring. She approached the first cabin and knelt beside its wall. From her bundle, she removed a small knife and 2 lengths of rope. She tucked them beneath the corner of the building, behind a loose board she had spotted earlier. Then she scratched a simple mark in the dirt nearby, 3 lines intersecting. Anyone who knew to look would understand tools here. She moved to the next cabin. Another bundle of supplies hidden, another mark scratched in the dirt. At the 4th cabin, she heard movement inside, someone coughing rising early. Mara froze. The door remained closed, but she could see candlelight through cracks in the walls. She waited, barely breathing, until the light moved toward the back of the cabin. Then she continued her work. By the time she finished marking the 6th cabin, the sky had begun to lighten. Gray dawn spread across the fields. Mara needed to make contact now before workers dispersed to their tasks. She circled around to the well where people gathered each morning to fill water buckets. She positioned herself in the shadow of the adjacent storage shed and waited. The morning bell rang. Cabin doors opened. Workers emerged slowly, moving with the careful exhaustion of people who had slept too little and would work too much. Mara watched them gather at the well, passing buckets, speaking in low voices. She recognized several faces. The older woman with gray braids who sometimes helped in the infirmary, and the young man who had nodded respectfully to Mara when she treated his injured hand months ago. She needed someone who would trust her quickly, someone who would act without asking too many questions. The gray, braided woman separated from the group, carrying her bucket toward the fields. Mara stepped from the shadows directly into her path. The woman stopped short, eyes widening. "Don't make noise," Mara whispered. "Please." The woman's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced around quickly to see if anyone was watching. "You're the healer from Charles's place. I need your help. Tonight, sunset. They're looking for you. They say you. I know what they say. Listen. There will be fire in the old storage shed. When the alarm sounds, move toward the equipment barn. Others will be there. Block the pathways with whatever you can find. Just for a few minutes. That's all I need." "Why should I?" "There are tools hidden under the cabins marked with 3 lines in the dirt. If you want to run, you can. If you don't, just cause confusion. Either way, tonight you have a choice you didn't have yesterday." The woman stared at her. Mara could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing risk against possibility, fear against hope. "Sunset," Mara repeated. "The old shed." She slipped back into the shadows before the woman could respond. Throughout the morning, Mara moved like a ghost across the plantation. She stayed in the margins, the spaces between buildings, the gaps in patrol routes, the moments when guards looked the wrong direction. Years of surveillance had taught her how to be invisible. She found the main communication lines that connected the watch posts. Simple rope systems with bells attached. She loosened the ropes at their anchor points enough that a strong pull would detach them completely. When chaos erupted, the guards would not be able to signal each other quickly. She moved to the storage doors near the stables. The hinges were old and rusted. She worked them with her knife until they hung by only 1 screw each. A strong push would knock them open, spilling contents and blocking the narrow pathway between buildings. By midday, she had positioned herself near the unused storage shed she had identified. It sat away from the cabins and the main house, far enough that fire would not spread, but close enough to trigger immediate alarm. Inside were old burlap sacks, broken tools, and stacks of dry wood that had been forgotten. She arranged the wood carefully, creating airflow that would make flames grow quickly. She placed the lamp oil bottles at strategic points. She prepared cloth fuses and positioned them where she could light them in seconds. Then she hid in the nearby brush and waited. The afternoon stretched endlessly. She watched guards change shifts. She watched workers move through their tasks with the mechanical efficiency of people who had no choice. She watched the sun arc across the sky, crawling toward the horizon. Her muscles cramped from staying still so long. Her throat was dry, but she did not move. Finally, the sun touched the western trees. Shadows lengthened across the plantation. The evening meal bell rang, and workers began drifting toward the dining hall. Mara waited until the guards rotated again. A brief window when positions changed and attention was divided. Then she moved. She lit the first fuse. It caught immediately, flame racing along the cloth toward the lamp oil. She lit the second, the third. Then she ran. Behind her, the fire roared to life with shocking speed. Flames leaped through the shed's walls, visible even in the fading daylight. Black smoke poured into the sky. Shouts erupted across the plantation. Guards ran toward the fire. Bells began ringing, not the gentle routine bells, but frantic alarm bells that cut through the evening air. Mara sprinted toward the equipment barn. She saw workers emerging from cabins, confusion on their faces. Some ran toward the fire, others stood frozen. Then she saw the gray, braided woman step into the pathway and overturn a wheelbarrow loaded with tools. They scattered across the ground, creating an obstacle. Another worker, the young man from the infirmary, kicked over a barrel of nails. They spread like seeds across the dirt. More workers appeared. Not all of them, maybe not even half, but enough. They moved with sudden purpose, dragging carts into pathways, opening gates that should stay closed, creating disorder that pulled guards in multiple directions. Mara used the confusion to reach Jonas's holding room. She had identified it earlier. A small building near the main house, heavily locked, but not heavily guarded. They had thought she would never get this close. The door had 3 locks. She pulled out her knife and worked the first one, her hands shaking but precise. It clicked open. The second took longer, her knife tip bending dangerously before the mechanism finally gave. The third lock would not budge. Behind her, she heard shouts growing closer. Guards were beginning to recover from the initial chaos. They would be here soon. She pulled harder on the knife. The lock held firm. Then the door opened from the inside. Jonas stood there, eyes wide but not surprised. "I heard you," he said. "I heard the fire and I knew. We have to run now." She grabbed his hand, and they fled toward the drainage ditch. Smoke covered the plantation now, thick and choking. It provided cover, but also made breathing difficult. Mara pulled Jonas close, wrapping her arm around him as they ran. A guard appeared in their path. Mara changed direction without hesitation, pulling Jonas between buildings. They could hear footsteps behind them, multiple pursuers now. They reached the eastern fence. The drainage ditch was just beyond it. Mara found one of her marked weak points and pushed hard against the fence post. It gave way, creating a gap barely large enough to squeeze through. "Go," she said to Jonas. "Crawl through quickly." He dropped to his stomach and wriggled through the gap. Mara followed, the fence scraping her back as she forced her body through. Her dress caught and tore, but she kept moving. They tumbled into the drainage ditch together. Behind them, the plantation was chaos. Fire, smoke, shouting, bells ringing endlessly. Some workers were running toward the marked escape routes. Others were still creating confusion, buying time they might never benefit from themselves. Mara did not look back. She grabbed Jonas's hand again, and they ran through the ditch, splashing through foul water. Heading toward the cane fields she knew lay ahead, they emerged from the ditch as full darkness settled over the land. The moon hung thin and pale above them. Its light filtered through the smoke that drifted from the plantation like a gray blanket. The cane field stretched before them, tall stalks creating a maze of shadows. Mara pulled Jonas into the cane, and they kept moving, pushing through the dense growth, heading toward the river she knew waited somewhere beyond. The cane fields seemed endless. Mara pushed through the tall stalks with Jonas's hand gripped tight in hers, her other arm raised to shield her face from the sharp leaves that sliced at her skin. The ground beneath them sucked at their feet with each step, mud clinging to their ankles and making every movement a struggle. Behind them, the shouts had faded, but not disappeared. The plantation bells still rang, their frantic clanging carrying across the fields like a warning that would never stop. Smoke drifted through the cane, creating ghostly shapes in the moonlight. Jonas stumbled. Mara caught him immediately, pulling him upright without breaking stride. "Keep moving," she whispered. "The river isn't far."
I can't. My legs. You can.
"I know you can." She did not slow down, could not slow down. Every second mattered now. Every breath they drew could be their last if the guards caught up. The cane gave way suddenly to marsh grass. Mara felt the ground change beneath her feet, becoming wetter, softer. The smell of the river reached her nose, that distinctive scent of slow, moving water and wet earth. They pushed through a final stand of reeds and emerged onto the riverbank. The water stretched before them, wide and dark, reflecting the thin moon in broken pieces. For a moment, Mara's heart stopped. What if the signals had not worked? What if no one had seen them? What if they were alone here with the guards closing in? Then she saw movement on the water. A boat, low and flat, bottomed, slipping silently toward the bank. A second boat followed it. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. A woman stood at the front of the first boat, her silhouette strong and certain against the moonlight. As the boat touched the bank, she stepped onto the mud without hesitation. "Mara," she said quietly. "Yes, I'm Ruth. Isaac told us to watch for your signals. We saw them 2 hours ago." Ruth's eyes moved to Jonas, then back to Mara. "We need to leave now. Can you both make it onto the boat?"
Wes?
"We can." Ruth gestured to the 2 men rowing behind her. They steadied the boat while Ruth helped Jonas aboard first. He collapsed onto the floor of the boat, breathing hard. Mara climbed in after him, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. The moment she was settled, the men pushed off from the bank. The boat slid backward into the current, then turned smoothly upriver. "Down," Ruth said. "Both of you stay low." Mara pulled Jonas close to her, both of them crouching in the bottom of the boat. She could feel his small body trembling against hers. She wrapped her arms around him and held on. Voices erupted from the direction of the cane fields. Plantation guards crashed through the reeds onto the riverbank. Mara heard them shouting, heard the confusion in their voices as they searched the darkness.
There. On the water.
Footsteps pounded along the bank. More guards appeared, their shadows moving frantically against the trees. "Faster," Ruth said calmly to the rowers. They leaned into their work, muscles straining as the boat picked up speed. A shot rang out. The bullet hit the water 20 feet away, sending up a splash that Mara heard but could not see from her position in the boat's bottom. Jonas jerked in her arms. She held him tighter. "Stay down," Ruth said. "They can't see us clearly in this smoke. They're shooting blind." Another shot, this one farther away. The guards were falling behind as the boat moved into deeper water where the current ran faster. Ruth remained standing, watching the bank. The smoke from the plantation fire had drifted across the river, creating a gray curtain between the boat and the shore. The guards' shouts became muffled, distant. After several minutes, Ruth finally sat down. "We're clear," she said. "You can sit up." Mara rose slowly, keeping one arm around Jonas. She looked back toward the plantation. She could still see the glow of the fire against the sky, could still make out the smoke rising into the darkness. But the details were gone now. The buildings, the guards, the fences, all of it had dissolved into shadow and distance.
Isaac,
Mara said. "Is it?" Ruth's expression shifted. "We don't know. He didn't make it to the Rendezvous point. That's all we know." Mara felt something twist inside her chest. Isaac had been captured because of her plan, because he had created the distraction that allowed her to reach Jonas. Whatever happened to him now would be her responsibility to carry. He knew the risks. Ruth said quietly, as if reading Mara's thoughts. "We all do. Every time we run these routes, we know we might not come back." Mara nodded but said nothing. Knowing the risks did not make the weight any lighter. The boat moved steadily upriver. The rowers worked in rhythm, their oars cutting through the water with practiced efficiency. Jonas leaned against Mara's side, his eyes closed, his breathing finally beginning to slow. The moon climbed higher. The smoke thinned. The river carried them forward. Mara watched the water slide past the boat's edge. She thought about the 17 overseers whose deaths had set this all in motion. She thought about Isaac, caught in the machinery of her revenge. She thought about the workers who had risked everything tonight to create chaos, some of whom would face terrible punishment when order was restored. She had broken something that could never be repaired, had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The woman who had ground herbs by candlelight 72 hours ago no longer existed. That woman had been replaced by someone capable of orchestrating death, of manipulating others into danger, of burning down the structures that confined her regardless of who else might burn. Jonas shifted against her. She looked down at his face, peaceful now in exhaustion. For him, she had done all of it. For him, she would do it again. That truth settled in her bones like certainty. "How far to the settlement?" she asked Ruth. "By dawn, we'll reach the first safe house. By midday tomorrow, the main settlement. You'll both be safe there." "Safe?" Mara repeated. The word felt strange in her mouth. She was not sure she understood what it meant anymore. The night deepened around them. Stars appeared between gaps in the smoke. The river narrowed as they moved farther from the plantation territories. Trees crowded closer to the banks, their branches creating a canopy overhead. Jonas woke as the first light of dawn touched the sky. He sat up slowly, looking around at the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where are we?" he asked. "On the river. Going north. Going away." He considered this for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his small journal. It was damp and crumpled but intact. He opened it carefully, smoothing the pages. "I want to write about tonight," he said, "so I don't forget." "You won't forget," Mara said softly. "I know, but I want to write it anyway." She watched him bend over the journal, his hand moving slowly across the page in the growing light. He wrote with careful concentration, his tongue poking out slightly between his lips, the way it always did when he focused hard on something. The boat rounded a bend in the river, and the landscape changed. The wild banks gave way to cultivated gardens. Small buildings appeared among the trees. People moved between them, their movements unhurried and purposeful. "The settlement," Ruth said. "We're here." The rowers guided the boat toward a wooden dock that extended into the water. Several people stood waiting there, watching the boats approach with expressions that mixed caution and welcome. Ruth stood and called out to them. Two more. Mother and son. They need shelter. A woman on the dock nodded. She was older, her hair completely gray, her face lined with years of sun and hardship. Bring them up, she said. The boat touched the dock gently. Ruth helped Jonas out first, then Mara. Their legs wobbled on the solid wood after hours on the water. The gray-haired woman approached them. She looked at Mara with eyes that saw everything. The torn dress, the scratches on her arms, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. I'm Sarah, she said. I help run this place. You're safe here, both of you. Thank you, Mara managed to say. Come, you need food and rest. We can talk about everything else later. Sarah led them along the dock toward the settlement. Mara walked slowly, one hand on Jonas's shoulder, taking in their surroundings. The buildings were simple but well maintained. Gardens grew in neat rows. Children played near one of the structures, their laughter carrying across the morning air. People looked at them as they passed, but without suspicion. With recognition, with understanding. They had all been fugitives once. They all carried stories of what they had left behind. Sarah showed them to a small cabin at the edge of the settlement. Inside were 2 beds, a table, chairs, and a window that looked out over the river. Rest, Sarah said. We'll bring food shortly. Tonight there will be a gathering where everyone can meet you properly. For now, just rest. She left, closing the door gently behind her. Mara stood in the center of the cabin, unable to quite believe they were here, that they had made it. Jonas sat on one of the beds, testing its softness. It's a real bed, he said with wonder. Yes. Can I sleep now? Yes. Sleep as long as you need. He lay down without bothering to remove his muddy clothes. Within moments, his breathing had deepened into sleep. Mara walked to the window. The settlement spread out below her, peaceful in the morning light. The river flowed past, carrying away the night's darkness. She thought about the plantation burning behind them, about Isaac's unknown fate, about the workers who had helped them and might now be facing consequences, about the path of destruction she had carved through the world to reach this moment. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. But Jonas was safe. He slept in a real bed in a place where no one could sell him away. That single fact made everything else bearable. At dusk that evening, after they had both rested and eaten, Mara stood beside Jonas at the settlement's edge, overlooking the river. Sarah had told her about the tide makers' work, how they moved people upriver toward freedom, how they needed experienced hands who understood strategy and planning. I want to help, Mara had said. Sarah had nodded unsurprised. We can use you. There are others who need what you needed tonight. Now Mara watched the water flow past, constant and patient. Jonas leaned against her side, his journal tucked under his arm. What happens now? He asked. Now we stay here, Mara said. We help others escape like we escaped. We build something new. Will it be safe? She thought about lying to him, about promising safety she could not guarantee, but Jonas had seen too much to believe comfortable lies. I don't know, she said honestly. But we're together and we're free. That's what matters. He considered this, then nodded. He opened his journal and wrote something quickly, then showed her the page. 17 men tried to stand between her and freedom. They did not understand my mother. Mara read the words and felt something break open inside her chest. Not quite joy, not quite peace, but something close to both. She put her arm around Jonas's shoulders, and they stood together as the sun set over the river, turning the water gold and orange and red. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tomorrow she would begin the work of helping others find their way to freedom. Tomorrow she would continue to carry the weight of what she had done. But tonight, They had reached the other side. Tonight, that was enough. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one. I've handpicked stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.